Hi everyone, I'm Daniel at QNAP, and I'm here to talk about our QM2 cards, and that's because we've just come out with some much higher performance QM2 options. But before I talk more about what is QM2 and why you might want one, I think it's helpful to know that over the past few years, there has been a great leap in storage technology, and that is that we now have NVMe SSDs. So in the past, SATA SSDs were considered to be very fast. Can you all hear me? I'm going to start over, make sure that you can all hear me. All right, let's try this again. Hi everyone, I'm Daniel at QNAP, and I'm here to talk about our QM2 cards. And that's because we've just come out with some much higher performance QM2 options. And now before I talk more about why you might want a QM2 and what a QM2 is, I think it's helpful to know that over the past few years, there's been a great breakthrough in storage technology, and that is that we now have NVMe SSDs. So in the past, SATA SSDs were considered to be very fast, but nowadays NVMe SSDs can be more than 6 times faster, and especially in over the past year, the price of NVMe drives has greatly decreased. So NVMe's keep getting faster, keep getting cheaper, and so you could buy NVMe's that get 3,000 megabytes per second or even more. And they're not even that much more expensive than traditional SATA SSDs. Really, this year they've got a lot faster, a lot cheaper, and so it's now at the point where small businesses and even consumers, it might be practical for them to use NVMe instead of SATA. So what is QM2? QM2 is a card that can hold 2 or 4 M.2 SSDs, and it goes into your PCIe slot to let your NAS use M.2 SSDs. And we have QM2 that take NVMe SSDs, and we have QM2 that take SATA. So why might you want a QM2? Well, it can let you use the much higher performance NVMe SSDs. So you could take an already very high performance NAS and make it much higher performance by using maybe SSDs that are 3,000 megabyte per second instead of using SSDs that are maybe 500 megabytes per second. You can save your 3.5-inch slots for capacity instead of maybe putting 2.5-inch SSDs in your 3.5-inch slot. Also, a QM2 can add high-end features to a low-end NAS, like M.2 for caching, for Q tier. We even have QM2 that can add 10 gigabit. And almost all of our new QNAP models now have PCIe slots, or at least one PCIe slot, so that almost all of our models can take a QM2. We have a lot of QM2 right now, so at first it might seem confusing which QM2 should you get, but there's really only 3 things you need to consider, and when you consider these 3 things, it should be apparent what the right QM2 is. We have QM2 for SATA SSDs and QM2 for NVMe, so just decide do you want NVMe or SATA. Decide how many M.2 SSDs do you want, because we have QM2 that take 2 SSDs, QM2 that take 4. And what is the PCIe bandwidth of your NAS? You could just look that up, because you're gonna probably want to match the QM2 PCIe bandwidth with your NAS PCIe bandwidth. And PCIe bandwidth is very important, and that's because it will greatly affect the performance that you get from your QM2. In fact, the throughput of your QM2 cannot exceed the PCIe bandwidth of either your QM2 or the PCIe bandwidth of your NAS PCIe slot where you put that QM2 in. So just for a reference, the PCIe bandwidth of Gen 2 PCIe by 2 is 8 gigabits per second. So you cannot get faster than 8 gigabits per second in a Gen 2 by 2. Gen 2 by 4, 16 gigabits per second. Gen 3 by 4, 32 gigabits per second. Gen 3 by 8, the limit is 64 gigabits per second. So let's say you got just the really top of the line, maybe 3,000 megabyte per second NVMe drives, but put it in a QM2 that was PCIe Gen 2 by 4. No matter how fast those NVMEs are, you cannot get more than 16 gigabits per second in a Gen 2 by 4. So this is why the PCIe bandwidth is really important. And so if your NAS has high PCIe bandwidth and you want to put the really fast NVMEs, you'd be a lot better off limiting yourself to 64 gigabits per second rather than 16, because 64 is extremely fast. So how do you select the right QM2? Well, first you look at the PCIe bandwidth of your NAS, because you're going to probably want to match your QM2 PCIe bandwidth with your NAS PCIe bandwidth. Decide how many M.2 SSDs you want, 2 or 4. Decide NVMe or SATA, and then choose a QM2 with the right PCIe bandwidth, probably the same PCIe bandwidth as your NAS. So in general, for a high-end NAS, you'll want a QM2 that takes NVMe drives and has high PCIe bandwidth. And for a low-end NAS, you'll probably have a QM2 with low PCIe bandwidth. So low PCIe bandwidth would be a Gen 2 by 2 or a Gen 2 by 4. High PCIe bandwidth would be 2 by 8, 3 by 4, or 3 by 8. So here's a list of our NAS that have PCIe Gen 3. So these are the NAS that have Gen 3 by 4, Gen 3 by 8, Gen 3 by 16. You might notice that the same NAS is on multiple sections, like the TSX71U series has more than one PCIe slot, so it has a PCIe Gen 3 by 4, but it also has a PCIe Gen 3 by 8. The 77 series also has a 3 by 8 and a 3 by 4. And I'm showing this to help you know your NAS PCIe bandwidth so that you would know what QM2 to get, since you're probably going to match the PCIe bandwidth. So this is all of our QM2 cards. It can seem like a lot to take in, and at first it might seem confusing. Well, which one do you choose when there's so many? But once I go over the naming rule, it should be apparent what the right QM2 is. But for right now, I want to show that we have QM2 that take SATA SSDs, SATA M.2s. We have QM2 that take NVMe M.2s, and we have QM2s that are PCIe Gen 2, QM2 PCIe Gen 3. So for these NAS with PCIe Gen 3, you're going to want a QM2 that is PCIe Gen 3. So I put a little box around them. So you'll want one of these 4 QM2s for these NAS. And which of the 4 will depend on the specific PCIe bandwidth and other factors like how many M.2s do you want, and it should be apparent which of these 4 once we go over the naming rule. So these are a NAS with PCIe Gen 2, Gen 2 by 2, 2 by 4. You might notice some of the same NAS, the 77 series I mentioned before, the 85 series, because they have multiple PCIe slots. They have PCIe Gen 2, but they also have PCIe Gen 3. And these are our QM2 that have PCIe Gen 2. To further narrow this down, I've categorized our QM2 by QM2 for low-end NAS and QM2 for high-end NAS. So for low-end NAS, you typically want QM2 with low PCIe bandwidth. And for a high-end NAS, QM2 that take NVMe drives and high PCIe bandwidth. And also I have them categorized by for 4 SSDs or for 2 SSDs. So let's just say you had a high-end NAS and you wanted 4 SSDs, you would want one of these 3 QM2. And which of the 3 will depend on the specific PCIe bandwidth of your NAS. So why wouldn't you want to put in a low-end QM2 in a high-end NAS? Well, our high-end NAS already have M.2 slots built in, and a high-end NAS will often have 10G already built in. So really, The only real reason to add a QM2 is if you can get significantly better performance off the QM2 than you would already get out of the built-in M.2 slots. And if you put in a low-end QM2, the performance of that QM2 may not be significantly better than the built-in M.2 slots. That's because a low-end QM2 will have a low PCIe bandwidth, and that will bottleneck your QM2. So it's generally just not worth it to put in a low QM2 into a high-end NAS, since a high-end NAS will already have M.2 slots. But if you put in a high-end QM2 into a high-end NAS, you should be able to get much better performance than you would get out of the built-in M.2 slots. So a high-end QM2 can take an already high-performance NAS and make it much higher performance. So why not put a high-end QM2 into a low-end NAS? Let me just give an example. Let's say you took our highest end QM2, the QM2 4P 384A, and put it in our TS453BE. Well, this QM2 can take 4 of our super high speed, or 4 of the really high speed NVMe drives. And it has a PCIe bandwidth, Gen 3 by 8, so a very high PCIe bandwidth. The problem is that the TS453BE has a low PCIe bandwidth of Gen 2 by 2. And as I mentioned before, the performance you get from the QM2 cannot be higher than either the PCIe bandwidth of the QM2 or the PCIe bandwidth of your NAS. So in this case, it doesn't really matter that the QM2 has a high PCIe bandwidth. You can't be faster than the PCIe bandwidth of this NAS, which is 2 by 2. So you don't really need this high-end QM2 because the performance you might get from this high-end QM2 is about the same as the performances you would get from our lowest end QM2, because either way you're limited by Gen 2 by 2 PCIe. So the best practice is typically just match the PCIe bandwidth of your NAS with the PCIe bandwidth of your QM2. So because you want to match PCIe bandwidth, let's go over the naming rule, because the name of the QNAP will actually, the name of the QM2 will actually tell you the PCIe bandwidth of your QM2. So here's an example, the QM2 2P344. The 2 here means that it takes 2 M.2 SSDs. The P here means that it takes NVMe SSDs. If it were to take SATA SSDs, there would be an S here instead. The 3 here means it is PCIe Gen 3. The 4 here means that it is 4 lanes of Gen 3. So this QM2 card is PCIe Gen 3 by 4. That is the bandwidth of the QM2 card. The second number here is the bandwidth of each individual M.2 in that QM2 card. So in this case, the bandwidth of the QM2 card is Gen 3 by 4, and the bandwidth of each individual M.2 is Gen 3 by 4. You see here Gen 3 by 4, Gen 3 by 4, and the bandwidth of the card is Gen 3 by 4. Let's take another example. Our highest performance QM2 4P384A. 4 because it takes 4 M.2s, P because it takes NVMe, and this card has a PCIe bandwidth of Gen 3 by 8, and the PCIe bandwidth of each individual M.2 SSD is 3 by 4. So you see 3 by 4, 3 by 4, 3 by 4. This is our lowest end QM2, like you might say most affordable, great for low end NAS. And it is takes 2 SATA M.2s, which is why you see 2S. It has a PCIe bandwidth of Gen 2 by 2. And you see a 0 here because it doesn't have a PCIe connection. Each individual M.2, rather than have a PCIe connection to the QM2 card, it has a SATA connection to the QM2 card. So that's why you see a 0 here. So how might you install a QM2 card once you chose the right one? Well, it's pretty simple. You remove the cooling module from your QM2 card, remove the protection pads, and then you install the M.2 SSDs, install the cooling module onto that QM2 card, and then you install the QM2 card into your NAS. So you see right here in this case, for this NAS, the QM2 card would go right there. That's where the PCIe slot is. Once you've installed it, go to Control Panel. You can go to System Status or check the QM2 card information at the dashboard. Go to Storage and Snapshots Manager to check your M.2 SSD information, and then configure and expand the SSD tier or do SSD caching. And you do that at the manager. So the QM2 card is not only for a QNAP NAS, but it can also go in a Windows or Linux machine, like your PC. And so it could greatly increase the performance of your PC. And so now to kind of summarize all of this, basically a QM2 can greatly increase the performance of your NAS. So just imagine if you already had, let's say, a really high performance TS1677 with built-in 10 gigabit, a Ryzen CPU. Let's say instead of doing caching with SATA SSDs that get maybe 500 megabytes per second, let's say you did caching with NVMe SSDs getting 3,000 megabytes per second. You can imagine that might greatly increase the performance, so that an already high performance NAS might get much higher performance. And even though we have a lot of QM2 options, if you match the PCIe bandwidth of your QM2 with your NAS, it ought to be apparent which QM2 you should get. So I want to say thank you very much. We're done, so you can ask questions, and either I or Nate will be answering questions now.